The people, I quote, I had read most in Europe and still felt closest to were Bob Cowper, Ginsburg, Kerouac, and Burroughs. For me, that was the America and the American poetry I was most interested in. Even more so, it was Ginsburg's Howl and Burroughs' Naked Lunch that first introduced Joris to American poetry overall. Books he had, by the way, come across in a small, indeed chiefly gay and erotic bookshop in Luxembourg City in his mid-teens. Although Joris has kept adding more Americas to his work, Deep Image, Black Mountain, language poetry and so on, and more continents too, the beats have certainly continued to resound and resurface in his oeuvre, right up to his most recent book of poetry, Balzac, 2012. In this paper I therefore propose to take Ginsburg, Burroughs, Pelieu and Kerouac as reading lenses that allow me to examine in greater detail their particular beat traces and translations in Joris's work. A good starting point for this examination, or beat reading, is the first issue of a very little magazine published by and for the community of Bard College in 1970. A magazine that, as you can see from the cover, has no title, it's nameless. Even in the brief editorial, it is simply called a magazine of prose. Although edited by Jonathan Kaplan, we can readily see Joris's presence all over this student or young poet publication. To begin with, for instance, in a 30-page long interview with Allen Ginsberg, conducted by Joris, Kaplan, and William Prescott. Incidentally, this December 3rd interview took place not so long after Joris's first meeting with Ginsberg, as we've just heard moments ago, after Kerouac's burial in October '69. Touching upon fellow poets and writers, police, religion, spiritualism, politics, Buddhism, Burroughs, drugs, Kerouac, and so on, this lengthy interview is, in terms of contents, literally all over the place, without being anywhere in particular really. And in that sense, it is, I think, emblematic of Ginsberg's importance for, or even impact on the work of Joris. There is little talk of Ginsberg's poetry as such, but what does come through is the charisma of Ginsberg, and the total intensity or cool of the encounter throughout what is certainly a fascinating overall discussion. Of course, some of Ginsberg's often longer early poems, notably Howl and Kaddish, and especially, as he just said, The Supermarket in California, along with some of the traveling tape recorder poems, prove an early important attraction for Joris, especially in terms of its wild imagery. Yet Joris very quickly and literally cut up or unworked such image-based poetry in his first real volume called The Fifth Season, published in '71, a topic Franca has beautifully examined elsewhere, so I won't speak to that here. What seems to be left then is Ginsberg's overall poetics and charismatic personality, which comes through very forcefully in the interview as well. Much more than his poetry, Ginsberg as a historical figure has in that sense always remained a presence in Joris's travels and travails, from those late 60s days on, right up to the poems for the millennium that Joris has just spoken of. If, however, we want to discuss direct and more far-reaching poetic influences and impacts, our magazine of prose invites us rather to look for a different start, one we find some 6 pages further along, namely 2 early cut-ups by Joris. These, of course, flag the possibility of reading Joris through a Burroughs lens, to see which new or other elements such a Burroughs reading would tease out in Joris's work. Now, Burroughs being a major poetic influence for Joris, there are several ways to go here. There is Burroughs' political thought, there is a non-linear writing, even the police machine, etc. Within the context of this paper, however, I'd like to stick to my cut-up and fold-in guns, especially as they can be seen as part of Joris's long-standing interest in collage, and how to make use of collage techniques in the 21st century. More than the Naked Lunch, on which Joris wrote at least one graduate paper, or even the cut-up trilogy, it was The Job that proved it to be an indispensable read here. Although Joris started experimenting with cut-ups and collage forms very early on, even before meeting Pelieu in the late 60s, and kept on experimenting with it, so apart from one or more unpublished cut-up and collage notebooks, the already mentioned Fifth Season is in part the result of a literal and conceptual cut-up. Burroughs' fold-in lens reveals much more interesting beat traces in Joris's later work. And with references to the news and newspapers, the title of the 2 poems in our unnamed magazine actually already lead the way. The first one is All the News That's Fit to Cut Up, and the second one is Cut Up New York Times, February 12, 1970. Permit me to give 2 clear instances in Joris's oeuvre to which a cut-up lens draws our attention. The first instance is the longer poem A Jay in Shortwave, which was first published in Hajar in 1999, and which, in a recorded performance, combines a constant background of shifting radio static, shards of world music, Nicole Perrifit singing or mixing in a French song, while Joris is reading his poem that consists of stanzaic blocks of text without punctuation or capitals, and which first line begins where the final line of the previous stanzaic block ends, i.e. somewhere mid-line. The piece can easily be read in the best Burroughs tradition. It not only uses a form of splicing apparently real radio broadcasts in the text or in transcriptions, in doing so it very critically writes through controlling mass media, from Radio Vatican to the furious mullah talking about the jihad on a competing radio station. A Jay in Shortwave can therefore be seen as a forceful form of counterwriting, with its many puns and double-edged lines breaking our verbal lines of association, another important Burroughs term, and thus increased awareness by reflecting on both the waves of the politically charged Aegean, i.e. the waves on the beach, and the invisible shortwaves of the medium radio as well. For instance, tune in the voices, invisible waves surround and pierce us, or who rules these waves, or still, a live voice, it must be true. The second instance is the fourth poem of the Canto Diurno series, named The Tag Extending from the Blade. This series is an open-ended sequence, there are now 5 of them, in which Joris, instead of using formal, that is spatial or material constraints, uses a temporal form to write in, namely the span or space of a day. Within those 24 hours then, Joris allows him to write the poem, or allows himself to write the poem rather. Once beyond the 24-hour mark, he can only delete or slightly edit the materials, but no longer add anything. What is interesting in this fourth Canto Diurno is Joris's new use of newspapers, which he explains as follows. In this specific case, the procedure consisted in picking on a specific day a specific number, 7 in the case of the tag sequence, of online newspapers or journal articles. Simply those that seemed the most interesting and engaging, downloading them, and in the next 2 weeks by a process of reading and choosing, of collaging, maybe the better term here would be interweaving, a number of sentences, usually one from each article, though I give myself permission to break such rules to create a sequence of 15 poems. Still, apart from obvious Burroughsian overtones in terms of the making of the poem, it is interesting to see how Joris continues much further down the radical road of collage and complex cut-ups. Canto Diurno number 4 certainly still ties in with nonlinearity, and is a method or procedure of going against the grain of conventional formal writing, but beyond that Joris also consciously and very literally plays with, for instance, what he calls the seams topography, that spelling, of the writing and the very language matter of his poem. Because of the complete lack of seams or folds, the text bits materially run into one another, so that it's impossible to determine their provenance or sentence territories, or to install hierarchical or narrativized meaning. Indeed, collage or complex cut-ups, a cut-up is thus used to create rhizomatic surcharges of meaning. Apart from Ginsburg or Burroughs, or a magazine of prose, furthermore also contains poetic work by Joris's friends, Claude Pelieu and Karl Weissner, 2 notable European beat translators and cut-up poets. The importance of Pelieu for Joris's work is, however, very complex, I think. As with Ginsburg, Pelieu seems to have been a crucial historical figure, and a very dear friend. But in terms of poetry, I don't think there is a palpable influence or impact the way Burroughs has clearly had, for instance. Joris seems to have valued Pelieu much more as a prose writer, and as a superb collage and cut-up artist, and as a translator. Again, still apart from a profound and lasting friendship, it is as a translator that Pelieu thus enters this paper. Joris had first met Pelieu and Beach in late '69 in the now legendary Chelsea Hotel, which is also where the couple introduced Joris to Burroughs. In these days, Pelieu and Beach were translating the Beat generation like madmen, as they had got the French publisher Christian Bourgois to publish pretty much all of the beats. Ginsburg, 18 Burroughs titles, Kerouac, Kaufman, Corso, Solomon, etc. Often as part of the publisher's now infamous and beautiful 18 paperback series. I have a couple of covers there. Seeing that the entire beat canon was too much for Pelieu and Beach to handle alone, and bearing in mind not only Joris's impressive mastery of languages, but also his interest in and knowledge of the beats, they proposed him to join them. So, they would continue working on, for instance, Burroughs, Ginsburg, and Kaufman, with Carl Solomon's Mishaps perhaps, and Corso's Elegiac Feelings American, and others would go Joris's way. This is a very interesting nexus in both Joris's work and our reading for beat traces and translations in it. The advance for the Solomon translation allowed Joris to move from New York to London in late 1970, where he again met Pelieu and Beach, who soon moved into the same apartment block Joris was living in, as well as Burroughs, who furthermore seemed to have had a habit of coming over to dine at the Pelieu's at least once a week. It was in London, therefore, and not in New York, that Joris did his well-known French beat translations for Bourgeois. This is remarkable in the sense that the beat attraction for Joris lay in 70 already in the past, namely the mentioned late 60s in New York and earlier years in Luxembourg and Paris. As in those early London years, he had moved on already to his other Americas, Charles Olson and Robert Kelly in particular. Indeed, the Solomon translation did not have a big impact on Joris, on the contrary, and even Corso, much like Julian Beck, seems to have been interesting and fun to do, but no more. The Nomad, that is Joris, had already moved on. This also brings us back to our magazine of prose. As Joris has explained in his paper, Kerouac is the one and only beat he has never met or never knew. And indeed, Kerouac is absent from the magazine of prose as well, except, of course, for talk of him in the Ginsburg interview. Kerouac is, however, in my reading, the major beat influence on Joris, apart from Burroughs, perhaps. Now, Joris's translation of Kerouac's Mexico City Blues was the last one he did for Bourgeois' beat catalogue. It was published in 1977 in 2 volumes, you can see the covers over there, along with the Corso, but the translations were done in 1973 and 1974. Unlike the other 18 beat translations, Joris's translation of Mexico City Blues was key for his poetry and poetics. Also in terms of what Clayton Ashelman, for instance, that other great American translator, would call apprenticeship. Before, however, looking into the blues, their translation and Kerouac's importance for Joris as a poet, I want to briefly explore the importance of that other great classic beat book, On the Road, in its relation to Joris's The Nomad Poetics. From my point of view, the attraction of On the Road for Joris is representative of his attraction to the beats overall. At stake was never the rather juvenile emulation of the beat road trip, but rather the beat poetry and poetics as an opening up of the space, as the open space of the US at that point. Think of the importance of space navigare in Burroughs' The Job as well. Being on the road, calling on often aleatory stops, equals being alive for both Kerouac and Joris, whose Nomad Poetics is in that sense very much a continuation along the road. That's also where the road splits, in that Kerouac's road simply stops, both quite literally and in the novel. Kerouac's road is mostly part of a road trip, after which he goes back to Mamere to write it all down as a memory babe. And secondly, the space of On the Road and most of Kerouac's novels is in many ways an essentially American space. Even Mexico City can be said to appear in part as not a real outside or opening up of the space, but rather as what an ideal, countercultural, or open American space could look like. It appears in that sense as a US space of ideal likeness, which is reflected in the increasingly vision-like description of Mexico with its streams of gold pouring down the sky all over Part 5. And with Mexico City as the conceptual outcome, indeed as the end of the road, or even as a pilgrimage. Such a sense of teleology, Mexico or other, is of course wholly absent from Joris's Nomad Poetics, in which the US opens the space of France and the UK, but where the Maghreb in turn opens up the Western cultural and writing spaces, and where the road simply continues on and on. And so as the road of the novel ends in Mexico City, Joris moves on to Mexico City Blues as well. Indeed, I think what most attracted Joris is the element that both books have in common, namely the presence and function of jazz music, and its effect on the language of both the novel and the long poem. The language experiments of On the Road, such as the use of the exact language, think here of Dean's speech, silly but funny wordplay like old Tex ass, the very precise and striking images Lester Young with eternity on his eyelids is nearly poetic, right? and the soundplay of language imitating jazz players, ee-ha, ee-lee-ha, crash, revelty, boom, crash, and so on, of course explodes in Mexico City blues. This time with Kerouac himself as jazz poet blowing the long blues, as the epigraph goes. Joris, for whom translation is the closest way of reading an author, must have been struck by the musical language matter of the poem. He certainly had a knack for ferrying over Kerouac's soundplay into French, as can be seen in, for example, the 135th chorus. Now, I intended first to discuss this more, but I'm going to be a bit briefer here. Indeed, note the total ease of enjambment in the first two lines, and the soundplay of là-bas dans ces plaines, picking up aller, or the dexterity of hurlement lu for moo meow, retaining the reference to Ginsburg's howl, or the arriero aller for backs and valleys, and its daring precision in retaining the English take a giant step. Joris's Kerouac is therefore not the confessional nor the spiritual poet. Kerouac's spiritual or mystic take on jazz, with Dean typically in trance and jazz players nicknamed gods, or the poésie pure, doing away with arbitrary conceptions in a quest for egoless emptiness, does not attract Joris in the least. Nor is it simply Kerouac's fascination with bebop that translates, for instance in Joris's equally important interest in free jazz. No, it is the way that interest translates in their poetry and language. And as such, Joris's Kerouac is the avant-garde poet, experimenting with chorus forms, mixed techniques, spontaneous writing processes, and above all, language matter. In both its powerful jazz music and its forceful active effect upon the reader in a poem as a happening, a poem as enacting something. Here is how Joris himself describes Mexico City blues. Kerouac's, I'm not going to read it entirely, Kerouac's is very much a jazz-based poetry, and the language itself is very American, but then Kerouac also gets a lot of kicks out of using crazy long Buddhist names, so that you have this total weirdness when you have the very fast beboppy American line hit by long names of Buddhist saints that you really have to play with as you try to read them, because of all the syllables that follow each other and that you have never encountered. He compared this actually to sort of reading it as a jazz solo, playing with the Buddhist names. Obviously, I spent a long time translating that specific book, but translation is relatively quiet business. And he continues, the launch in Paris of his French translation happened with Steve Lacy playing in the background on his sax. This Kerouac, the jazz poet, blowing his language's sound, is one that seems to have accompanied Joris in many ways to this day, just like Kaufman has, whom I can't discuss here due to time restrictions. As it happens, however, I have just finished an essay on Joris's latest collection of poems for a book that Franca is editing, entitled Meditations on the Stations of Mansour al-Halash, which allows for an illuminating view of how relevant a reading of Joris's work with Kerouac the jazz poet as a lens can be. The collection consists of 40 poems, after the 40 stations found in the writing of the Sufi poet Mansour al-Halash. The following poem, the second meditation entitled O Rahab, for instance, easily recalls Kerouac's jazz musicality with its staggering soundscape. That up here as well, it's a very short poem. Here, Gawking literally and semantically contains the all and splits up in two riffs that interlace. The first one, see and unseen, sonorously linked to seam and between which various sound particles seem to appear between the words as well. Think of unseen, to, we, or, can be. It has all of the little particles of between in there. And the second riff, scarce, scars, which is expanded through internal rhyme, scarce and where, and visual rhyme, the A and the C in the scarce, scars, space, can string. Here too the line breaks create surcharges of meaning. Think of cut up again. The dexterous or cut into we, a cut that literally scars you when facing it, as it does the or and seam. But even more so, it is the syntactically volatile line breaks in the first three stanzas that form a remarkable apocoinu. When you see it, it scares you, or it scares you where it's the unseen, which makes all the difference, of course. And where it's the unseen, you seem to want to care, and so on. The syntactic ambiguity continues till the very end, even though facing the or that is between the thing and the it scars you, its relation or the we can be. This is Joris's infamous caravan of syntax and sound pushing on, with a relational we returning later on in the 35th meditation, an I, a you, a we, all. Much like the chorus forms, although not bound by a notebook page and therefore more varying in length, the meaning moves through the sound, through the quick-paced syntax, indeed through the images of the poem, and through the different meditations, like the choruses. Like Kerouac's mixed technique ideas that vary and sometimes roll from chorus to chorus, or halfway through a chorus to halfway into the next. Of all the beats, Kerouac's influence in that sense has remained both the most lasting and the most explicit, even more so than Burroughs, as can be seen in the 1999 Canto Diurno No. 3, A to Jack Kerouac, Ode Bilingue. A complete reading of the poem lies far beyond the scope of this paper at this point, but it is useful as a short coda to complete the picture of the avant-garde Kerouac that has remained important for Joris, and whose traces and translations can obviously be found here too. The space of 24 hours to write the basic language material of the poem here registers a road trip to Kerouac's Lowell, complete with pictures actually. And it is in this homage to Kerouac the ode also mixes in reflections on the beats, on the life and work of Kerouac, and on translations. Two elements seem important here. What is first of all remarkable is that the poem is written in both English and French, a language Joris hadn't written poetry in since '67, obviously to bring in Kerouac's Francophone Canadian background. This topic, multilingualism, minor and minority literatures, and in that sense the sense of Kerouac's Pelieu as well, warrants a study in itself. The second, even more important element is so obviously staring in the reader's face that it is often forgotten, namely the whole procedure of the Canto Diurno, of course revolves around Joris's own writing processes, which relate in more than one way to Kerouac's spontaneous prose. Why else have a 24-hour format to basically write whole long poems in? Suffice it, however, to quote from this third Canto Diurno, saluting the beats in passing. This is my final quote. Jack's nights, mon teenage dream of America, my truck stop blues, and blues for Jack. Gone these 30 years now, and Alan gone, and William gone. Me reste Gregorio and Nueva Yorkio, spitting smack in the face of death. Reste Sanders à Woodstock working for the city, et puis Claude à Binghamton, careening down carroted bypaths. Et donc, il n'est jamais trop tard, Jack. Repassez sur ta tombe, passez en trombe. Thank you very much.